Hello again, everyone. Charles J. Baserap here with the penultimate part of Racism in America, the season premiere miniseries event on #TheThing. If you haven't yet, definitely please go hit up parts 1 through 3 and be sure to subscribe for future episodes. Now, those of you who have been with me to this point, thank you. You know we got into some pretty heavy stuff. Some has been hard to hear, and truthfully, it was really hard to write. And those last two especially were emotionally and mentally draining, and these last two coming up, they're going to be veritable roller coasters. In this episode, we're going to be talking about solutions to move forward, things that we can do to start making gains on combating racism outside of the demonstration aspect of things we've already talked about. This is going to require a lot of soul searching for some people and a mutual understanding of one another, because this isn't something that should be or can be the burden of any one group alone. Now, we're all on this giant ball of mud and rock and water, and we've only got one go at it. So it's time we started listening, stop picking fights and deflecting, and see what we can do together. While we're at it, I'm going to be discussing some pros and cons of athletes and celebrities and their contributions, or lack thereof in some cases, as we head into one final video of the miniseries after this one. So thank you again for joining me and trusting me to maybe entertain and inform. I hope you're getting something out of these and viewing them in their entirety. There's a point to all of it when it comes together. The struggle for racial equality and justice is both real and necessary. It shouldn't be at this point in our nation's life, but it is. And we need to make sure it's one that we keep fighting for until it's won, and then make sure it stays that way. Various protests have rightfully sprung up out of the events of the unlawful deaths of Black Americans at the hands of our law enforcement, and so have violent and destructive riots. No matter how many people deflect and accept and encourage the violence of any parties or entities on any side, it doesn't make them any less wrong. And honestly, it's really easy to say burn it all down when it's not your stuff burning, and we've seen that, we have. There was a guy who used to write about basketball for ESPN, and on a Twitter pic of a building in flames in California, a building that was allegedly being constructed for low-income housing, mind you, he wrote something to the effect of, "Good, let's burn it all to the ground." Because when I think peace and lives mattering, I automatically think destroying housing for our most vulnerable. Makes sense. But then a day or so later, he was tweeting and crying about, in his words, animals that were looting and rioting because they'd apparently smashed the gates of what he called his sister gated community, and he was scared, suddenly warning the police he'd recently been calling to fuck, and furious that they destroyed the Starbucks he frequented. Jeez, man, can you think of a tragedy greater at a time like this than this poor guy who wanted everything to burn, not being able to get his Cafe Grande nobody cares in the morning? How can we sleep knowing that? Alyssa Milano is one of several celebrities calling for an up to 90% defunding of the police, saying all that money would be greater spent on homeless and children, and the police are all bad guys. Until she needed them, and called them over a teen shooting an air rifle at squirrels in the neighboring plot that she said was a potential active shooter possibly on her property. In cities like New York and Minneapolis, people are literally begging for help, and cops I've spoken to in both of those cities have said their hands are tied and all cops are scared, not just because of the assassination attempts that have jumped precipitously since George Floyd's murder in May, but it's just doing their jobs, because it seems more and more going into this suicide by cop option or doing things to provoke confrontations to be immortalized, or trying to instigate events to film and selectively edit. Several cities have already reported that names and addresses of cops have been released on the internet, and cops and families are being threatened. Record numbers of police in New York City were retiring because they're tired of a no-win scenario, of the automatic bad guy when the overwhelming majority are doing their jobs correctly and getting spit on and attacked and shot at for it. I saw a lot of "Dear white people, your black coworkers are not okay, but they're showing up to work this morning" type articles when this started. But you know what? "Dear America, your law-abiding police officers are not okay, but they're showing up to protect you regardless. We're conspicuously absent." A young girl lost her father. Cop killed in duty. So she posted a tribute on her Twitter page. She was harassed by strangers so badly she had to delete her account. The comments were saying things like he was finally a good cop because he was dead, and that she needed to read the room and not post things positive about cops at this time. Opinion pieces ran that all cop shows should be canceled, and even things like Paw Patrol were dangerous for showing children overly positive depictions of law enforcement. That upset my 6-year-old. But when people have needed them through all this, they've been coming. Law enforcement is not perfect, and absolutely needs to be held accountable for its past, present, and future, but they, like other groups, don't deserve to be lumped in together. If you feel that strongly, that all cops are bad, you're one of these ACAB types, next time you need one, don't call. Call 912 or someone who gives a shit. But if you do call on them, guess what? They don't care that you hate them. They'll still come, and most of them by far you'll be appreciative for. People in these cities are learning that more and more. So yeah, these people encouraging it tend to back down when they realize, geez, those flames are getting a little closer. Maybe I should have thought this all the way through. And yeah, people like Alyssa Milano think the police don't need certain equipment and want them 90% defunded, then call the cops when they're scared, and she doesn't see the need for cops to have certain stuff because she can retreat to the safety of her gated multi-million-dollar mansion. She can point to a military-style vehicle in use by the LAPD and histrionically lament like how many kids it could feed instead, but never asks, hey, how many kids could I feed by giving some of my money to those causes while I sit sharing this land and giant mansion with one other person and a dog? When she senses danger nearby, does she call a crisis counselor? An NBA All-Star? Another actor? No. She calls the cops and she realizes when they show up with over half a dozen vehicles, including a helicopter, on her behalf. Whoops, they couldn't do that without funds. But isn't that almost always the case? That we often don't think of or acknowledge something until it hits closer to home and affects us directly? I didn't realize how poorly maintained my county's playing fields were until I started coaching softball. Suddenly, I took action with the county council. That's something small scale. This is larger. But it's also why it's important for white people to be more willing to listen, not to the rioters, but to the ones at the base of the riots, the ones justifiably angry. And stop trying to use anecdotal or broad generalized evidence or not me, I'm a good one to downplay racism. Because even if they're not actively perpetuating it, they're usually, and I'm in that they, not aware of it, and acknowledging feels like a personal attack that's shameful and guilt-ridden, so people get naturally defensive and respond as such. But that isn't an excuse not to acknowledge, not to talk about it, because as uncomfortable as it may be, it's necessary, and we cannot possibly move forward to the future today if we can't have a reckoning with our past, regardless of whether or not we personally or anyone we ever knew or could have known ever did anything wrong. Because while it is definitely wrong to assume that every white person who has succeeded in anything has only done so because of racism, as is commonly used by some more inflammatory pundits, it must be acknowledged that white people on average have overall benefited from privileges we may not even know are there. Being less likely to be followed around the store and suspected of theft just for the color of your skin? Guess what? That's a privilege. It shouldn't be. But it's something that black people on average don't have. Now, yes, I've been followed around stores, back in my heavy metal guitar, band playing days, walking into a 7-Eleven with my spiked bracelets on and all black and nail polish and all that. But that's not the same thing. Because if I'd walked into that same store in a suit and tie, I wouldn't have been followed. Blacks don't have that ability to just change clothes and make prejudice disappear. White privilege is a real thing. It isn't something uniformly distributed and is often used as a scapegoat or a means of denial by both sides, one thinking it doesn't exist in any capacity because they've had objectively and subjectively hard times in life and see plenty of minorities around them meeting or surpassing their own success, others thinking that it's all there is and blaming all of their ills on it and trying to dismiss white successes and those of other blacks as just being lucky and anomalous. The question of privilege and how deep it goes or doesn't go is beyond the scope of this piece, and one we'll probably revisit in a later video, along with discussions on topics like affirmative action and how much they help or hinder. And there are some things people don't think of as privilege or consider overall experiences that actually are, and those that assume that things are all privilege and use it as something of a catch-all to shift blame from any shortcomings. And it needs to be discussed in more than just a few lines to really get it beyond what's been said already, because it's a heated topic on both sides, especially when both sides both agree and disagree with one another on its scope, prevalence, and effects. If you're white, just because you don't actively see something as a privilege or know of how the justice system has treated blacks compared to whites, even in terms of sentencing and bail setting alone, that doesn't mean it isn't real at all. And blacks, just because you didn't get something or something happened, it doesn't always mean it was some sort of conspiratorial plot against you and you never had any chance of succeeding. Those extremes don't work. I know of many blacks who weren't offered jobs based on the blackness of their names or have been assumed that they only got into certain schools or positions solely on affirmative action and not because they legitimately earned their spots. Now me, I worked hard my whole life. I sacrificed and scrimped and saved and studied and fought for scholarships, for jobs, for my very name and livelihood at one point, so that I could be only the second in my white family after my older sister to be able to go to a real, 4-year university. Working five part-time jobs at one point doing it because my dad was unemployed and we lost our financial aid because he got a severance package that showed up as income on tax return. So school was like, screw it, they don't need money. But he was unemployed for years. So I understand why people get mad when they're automatically assumed life was handed to them or hear the old born on third thinks he hit a triple nonsense. See, you don't know me. And anytime you say to me that I don't know what it's like to be judged on the color of my skin or my gender, well, guess what? You're doing it now. You're making an assumption of me, the individual, based on my belonging as to a collective historically at the top end of the overall power dynamic. Don't. This is the first step towards moving forward, getting rid of these stereotypes and these assumptions. Listen to each other, to ourselves, to our shared histories and fears and hopes and dreams. Because too often conversations on race begin with one side yelling white privilege at everything and the other side accusing them of playing the race card every 5 minutes. Not productive. It needs to start with us, how we accept what's come before and what's happening now. And we have to stop demanding one side sit idly and listen and never be allowed to speak because historically they've had more of a voice. Then it's no longer a discussion. It's a lecture. You're no longer speaking with, you're talking at. And I get that Black voices need to be amplified right now, more than ever, and they need to be listened to, and they definitely should be listened to. But if you want me and others like me to be allies, you need to listen too. You need to accept some housekeeping responsibilities as well. And you need to see that even though we're not the same aesthetically, or have had the same experiences in life, we still have things to offer one another. I know you're tired of hearing from us, and that we shouldn't be allowed to hijack, for lack of a better word, a movement in a series of virtue signaling throughout social media and beyond, and step on your voices. But as much as you want us to understand rightfully your feelings, your ideas, what you're thinking and going through right now, we want that as well, because that's how a true partnership works. You think about your spouse or significant other. Is that relationship working if it's all one-sided? No. That's how the marriage has been for too long in America, a one-sided tilt towards white. But the solution isn't to tilt it to the other extreme. It's to balance the board. That's what equality is. Some people seem to be less intent on that than on some eye-for-eye vengeance and a continued imbalance while they keep tallies for a scorecard only they know the numbers for, and that's not how it should work. I am an ally. I'm not a subservient. I don't want to read your dissertation to dear white people that condescends to me. Here's what you must do to be an ally that often reads like a list of demands and not suggestions. I have opinions whether you like them or not. And I'm not going to be an ally if that entails never going off the cue cards you've given me, because then it becomes like those people trying to force that woman to raise her fist. And I'm a guy staring dead-eyed into a camera, reading my lines from a script while a BLM flag hangs in the background and the threat of cancellation or the label of racist looms over my head. That's not an ally. That's a hostage. You want my help. I want to help. I am here to help. I am here for you, to back you in this fight, but I am not going to be a puppet. I don't want to be the puppet master. I certainly don't want that. But when you start stifling all dissension and anyone not in lockstep and people come to fear that so that they say what you want to hear, no real good comes of that. And it doesn't become genuine anymore. If I threaten you that I'll shoot you if you don't give me your wallet and you give me your wallet, did you really want to give it to me? Or just not get shot? Equal rights doesn't equal special rights. As some people seem to, believe and act when they demand, as an activist recently did at the CVS in DC, by publicly recording and shaming the owner for calling the cops on 2 shoplifters. He explained it was store policy. He wasn't going to press charges, but he'd have them barred from coming back. She told him he was wrong for following the policy and insinuating that calling the cops put them, the criminals who shoplifted, in danger of being killed because that's what happens every time cops show up to the scene with young black men. To her, if someone shoplifts or commits a crime and is black, they shouldn't have to be held accountable. No. We had a bakery near Oberlin College that came under fire for daring to punish a minority student that was using a fake ID, and then had 2 accomplices engaging in shoplifting, and then one of them assaulted the shop owner when they tried to call the cops. And people from the school were protesting the store and calling it racist and tried to have it shut down before they were sued and lost in a defamation suit, and rightfully. We had Deshaun Jackson playing in the NFL that's made itself so woke with social issues, watching a game is like sitting in a room with perpetual alarm clocks, get away without a fine for repeating anti-Semitic remarks uttered by a known hate group leader, Louis Farrakhan? And can we please stop with the "we didn't know he was hateful" nonsense? If you knew enough to know his name, you damn well know his story. He's been around a good long while. We had Jussie Smollett staging a hate crime, wasting police resources and causing protests and angry rhetoric. He wasn't even charged and got to walk under really, really shady circumstances. All right? But see, those cases, there's a lot like those. And those become the auto defenses about, when some white people hear about racism and privilege, when they can go, "Oh, yeah, what about this privilege and double standard?" And they're right, it's a double standard. It is a hypocrisy. And just because it's not one afforded to blacks as often as it is to whites, that doesn't make it any less BS. But when I talk about housekeeping, this is what I mean. This is what Terry Crews meant. Don't just speak out about racial injustice. Don't just speak out when a white cop might have wrongly killed a black man. A big reason why so many white people still don't understand Black Lives Mattering is because to them it feels selective at times. They're missing the point. But it's easy to see how they can when we have hundreds killed in cities like Baltimore and Chicago, etc., and not a word is said. And when people like Terry Crews or a black Republican or a black celebrity want to address it, they're called traitors. They're called Uncle Toms. They're called Oreos, black on the outside, white on the inside. They're accused of being too white. There was an episode of Fresh Prince that handled, racial profiling when they were pulled over for being black, driving while black, a very real thing. There was also another episode where Carlton was denied entry into a black fraternity because he wasn't seen as black enough. And Uncle Phil found out and was furious, saying that he had worked hard to provide a good life for his kids and his family to show that they can succeed despite the obstacles society put in their way, and yet they were still blacks putting up more tripwires and tearing one another down for that success. That right there needs to stop. There needs to be an acknowledgement of the crime in certain areas and the refusal to take any responsibility for it. And blacks saying there's a problem need to be able to be heard as well and not considered traitors. Why should demanding people hold themselves to nonviolent acts or staying in school or doing something more to combat a staggering out-of-wedlock birth rate that's been provably linked to lowered chances of success, especially in minority communities due to racism and racist policies? Why should those things be white things? A lot of white people don't get that. And to them, I'd like to point out that there's a lot of peer pressure within the black community to, quote, keep it real, with more than a few black musicians even going as far as to lie and say that they're from certain areas of backgrounds to gain more street credibility. And while it may seem odd that someone saying something like being educated is too white, it does not mean that blacks don't believe in education, or that they believe being educated is bad. That's not at all what they mean. Rather, it's because blacks in America have had so much stolen from them, from freedom to credit for cultural contributions. So to just voluntarily abandon things or fully assimilate into the majority, into a system that, they'll go to the school, but they won't learn anything about them. They'll only learn white stuff. It can be met with resistance and feel like it's a way of just becoming or continuing to be invisible in the crowd. But there also needs to be an end to the stay in your lane whitey when we try to say anything, as if we have nothing to offer to the dialogue or to the solution when we're trying to be allies and partners and coexist the way we should. And I know that's easier for me to say, coming from a place of more privilege on average, and being able to stand up without getting knocked down, as often as others, by their peers or otherwise. But now that brings up what I call the Dolezal-Krug Paradox. Rachel Dolezal and Jessica Krug are two women who became household names not for their contributions to teaching or awareness of racial and social justice issues, but for being white women that pretended to be black. Not in a ha-ha Robert Downey Jr. satirical way or an old-school minstrel show way. They lied about their ethnicities to get into certain positions. One a leader in the NAACP of all places, the other as a teacher and published author. Black people were mad, and they should have been. This is true theft. This is true cultural appropriation. This isn't how it's often misapplied, like when a little white girl wants to be Moana for Halloween. This is straight up insanity level, senator running for president cultural theft. But here's the thing. Until black people knew the truth, they listened to them because they believed them to be black like them. Inga Brinkman of Africa Today, in a review of Krug's published book on West African cultures, Fugitive Modernities, wrote that the book had a lot to offer, and its insights into the history are valuable. Writing for the Journal of African History, Henry Lovejoy wrote, "This intellectual history of Kasama is impressive. Her book will enable scholars to reconceptualize how Africans influenced the Black Atlantic socially, politically, and intellectually. Author Mariana Candido called the book a major contribution to historiography on West Central Africa, among other praises. Krug's students seemed to like her, and though some colleagues had some doubts about her changing background stories, she was overall well regarded. She was seen as a sign that a Black woman could rise to a strong position, this one teaching African history at George Washington University, and to become a powerful voice. But she wasn't Black. She stole that. She was yet another white person stealing from Black people and their contributions and taking another opportunity away from a genuine Black person in that position. And yet, despite that, though people are rightly angry now, my point is that until the moment she came clean, her words were heeded and thought valuable. Do her lies, does her deceit, make her scholarly insight now any less true or important? See, that's the danger of automatically assuming that I need to stay in my lane and can't offer anything at all because I'm not part of the family, as it were. Because here we have two women that weren't either, who were imposters but garnered praise and attention. So clearly they had something to offer despite that deceit. And now here's where I need to talk to white people about this, and that includes me. I'm talking to myself as well. I'm not perfect. Just because we may have something to offer, that doesn't mean there aren't times that we need to just simply shut the F up and listen. Don't respond with all lives matter. Don't talk about that time you cried during 12 Years a Slave or this one time you thought a cop was harassing you so you literally know everything they're going through. No. Just shut up a second. Let them have their turn. This is part of that conversation thing I was talking about. As much as you may want to help and offer support, and that's cool, there are times you have to know when to hold back and just be the shoulder to cry on. It's important to stand up against racism when it's there, and it's important also to call out racism by your peers. That needs to happen more. If you're complaining about the violence and the riots, okay, great. But you also need to do that equitably. You see white nationalist groups causing trouble or making threats or hijacking peaceful protests? Be willing to say, no, enough. That is not what this country is about. Don't sit there and see them, oh, that's just a small, portion of it, because that's how they grow. Saying you're against racism in a room full of people who agree with you is all well and good, but if you're a person just focusing on the violent aspects of the movement or protesting things like all lives matter every 5 seconds, you're showing you still don't get what this is about. And as well-intentioned as it may be saying, well, I don't see color or race, it also misses the mark. It's a lot easier for a white person to say that because when it comes down to it, race and color don't see you either, not in the same way. For lack of a better term, we're the default setting when it comes to most protagonists, in stories or video game templates or political frontrunners or whatever. We're automatically there and accounted for, whereas blacks have to work harder to get that recognition. So while such comments are very, and I'd say the majority of the time, frequently meant as a way to say you don't judge people based on race or color, which is a good thing, by saying that you don't see it, you're failing to realize a lot of that is because you don't have to. Societal and legal systems aren't making those racial differences as blatantly in your face by their treatments of you for them. There are a lot of whites who like to talk the talk and say, yeah, we're on board, look at my profile picture, but then still go into white flight mode when neighborhoods hit what they call the racial tipping point in sociology. Or still fight against better integration of schools because they feel it might lower the standards of education for their own children. Or still actually appropriate black culture and seem to appreciate it more than them. Or still fail to realize why we have a Black History Month and complain that there's no White History Month. Black History Month is not there to cheat white people out of anything or diminish them in any way. It's because black people were, and still are, cheated out of recognition for accomplishments and contributions to this nation. Yes, we all learn about Washington, D.C. and its founding, but how many history books of yesterday or even today really talk about how much was built on the back of slaves? And just because that happened hundreds of years ago, that doesn't make it any less important to the here and now. It's extremely relevant. So yeah, we talk about how Jesse Owens looked cool doing the Black Power salute at the Olympics in front of Hitler, as a big FU to the Nazis, but it was also kind of one to the U.S. Because here's a guy running, capturing a mortal glory to represent a country that won't even allow him to be represented in the vote, a country that won't let people like him in the same schools as people like you and me, And he still gave it his all and showed the world he wasn't a fraction of a human being. He was a damn hero. That goes for the black forces who fought in the world wars and so on. So you're right, we don't have a White History Month because we don't need one. White history may not be advertised as such, but it's undeniably the prism through which our historical gaze has heretofore been focused through. So that's not helping. It's also not helping to become a self-loathing sycophant, constantly feeling you have to make these grand standing at the window with a boombox gestures to prove that you know how all white people are bad, but not you. You're one of the good ones. Pay attention to me. The movement involves you, sure. It involves us. But it's not about you and how virtuous you are. You trying to hog the limelight by posting a TikTok of you singing a song about your feelings isn't about them. It's about you. Be honest. Padma Lakshmi, who I know isn't white, but it's an example of this, she posted a picture on Instagram recently when she turned 50, and it was called Heartfelt and Brave. It was a selfie of her in a revealing bikini that was like 40% cleavage, and it came with a message of unity and love. And when I think racial injustice and inequity in the nation, nothing shows that like a rich woman's boobs on the beach while we're all locked up in quarantine. I guarantee more people were clicking like because of the picture. They didn't even realize there were words there at all. When you're not doing anything but posting on a forum that's already 90% in line with your views, and you feel the constant need to feel brave and post popular consensus in an echo chamber, hey, free speech, have at it. Not everyone has the opportunity or privilege to be more physically involved and attend rallies, and some don't have the real will or means to contact local and governmental leaders or organize something within the community. I get that. But it can often come off as shallow, especially when you're constantly patting yourself on the back for how opposed to violence you are, but then conveniently say nothing when violence is committed by people acting on behalf of these causes. And when you're called out on it, you twist yourself into knots to explain how it's totally different, when really what it often comes down to is you didn't want to speak up, because a lot of times, if you're truly being honest with yourself, you're more afraid of what someone else might think of you, because it's going against the grain of your in-group. And we've already seen multiple times what happens to too many people who go against groupthink, because we've always been at war with Eurasia, and you're running late for your 2 minutes hate. Stuff like that needs to stop. You don't need to do that. And when it comes to being an ally in a group, being a militant one and trying to lecture everyone and speaking on behalf of people that didn't even ask you to speak up in the first place, that doesn't help either. It's actually rather patronizing. When you're sitting there and saying, well, black people are strong and powerful and should be treated as equal, hey, he's eating white bread. You know how offensive that probably looks right now? I need to stand up and defend them because they need me. Yeah, they need you for support and understanding and to be an ally and for you to just not be a racist dick. But they don't need a babysitter and a literal white knight. Just seemingly little things like making sure you set a good example for your kids without going off on screeds. That's helpful. Encourage them to play with other kids from different backgrounds, to start at an early age, to show that there's strength in our diversity as a nation and that we're more the same than we aren't. That's more helpful because, racism, it isn't something inborn. It's taught and it's fostered. Because you sound a lot like the person who prefaces things with, well, I have a black friend, so. And a lot of white people, regular citizens, people in companies, comic books, movies, they're seemingly walking on eggshells right now, trying to overcompensate for the real issue of racism by tearing other groups down to lift up another in divisive and transparent displays, which is backfiring because some people, black and white, are starting to push back and tune out because it often comes off as cloying and insincere, despite the intentions that may be good. And people often don't want to be preached at or pandered to. There's a fear amongst some black groups that, while being appreciative of assistance from white people, that a movement can be less about them. And it's a fear that associates of John Lewis had in the 60s, and he had felt that some of them had felt that the movement was becoming a little too white. And he reminded them then, like Terry Crews did today, that they needed one another. Because if they joined together, it wasn't any longer blacks versus whites. It was a unified people versus the irrationality of racism and prejudice. So, yeah, listen to one another, black, white, everything else. Stop trying to devalue a person's individual experiences because it isn't yours or you assume it can't be of any impact. Stop trying to one-up each other on some sort of twisted victim Olympics and demand people show their receipts before being allowed to be heard. Stop trying to make issues into racial ones when they're not. Sometimes you don't get a job because the place legitimately discriminated, and that's awful. Sometimes you don't get a job because you just weren't the right person, and that's life. I know it feels like it's always against you, and there's so much history to show it's happened far too many times, but don't become the boy who cried racist. We know that story. We know how it ends. Stop avoiding calling things out. Stop making assumptions. This is to everybody. If something happened X way, it would have been different. I see that all the time. New story comes out about a white guy who committed the crime and the police apprehend him, and invariably there's comments like, well, I bet if he was black, he'd have been killed. Story hits that some actor made some racially offensive remarks about a black coworker and loses a spot on a TV show, and invariably there's comments like, well, I bet if he was black and said it about a white guy, he'd have kept his job. I want white people to distance themselves from people like Dylan Roof and groups like the KKK. And I'd like blacks to distance themselves from the malevolent actors in the BLM movements and Antifa and stuff like that without qualification, and not make excuses because they also happen to be on your side for the moment. Everyone needs to stop with the trying to erase all vestiges of American history and sanitize it 1984 style, holding it up to an imaginary utopia that never existed or will exist by destroying statues and defacing monuments with the same almost religious fervor that the Taliban and ISIS did when they tried to make their countries clean of anything in their past that went against the New World Order that they wanted to bring about. Especially writing obscene things on ones you only think are wrong, like when some groups defaced a monument in honor of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. Yeah, that's the all-black regiment that fought in the Civil War, immortalized in the movie Glory. Whoops. Yeah, it's awful that Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. It doesn't erase all the good that he did. We can't fault people for not being as woke and aware as we are now, back when the entire world was asleep and doing this. America is always blamed for everything that other countries are given free passes for because reasons. Stop beheading statues and calling the monuments you praise when President Obama stood in front of them fine as evil when President Trump does. Trying to destroy people who did so much good for flaws that weren't even flaws at a very flawed time is inane. And where does it end? Do we eventually ignore Dr. King because of his alleged infidelities? Or Gandhi for his willingness to go along with some Nazi plans if it meant getting the British out of India? Stop trying to alter the definitions of words to fit an agenda and absolve people from their behaviors and words. The definition of racism is a belief that race is a fundamental detriment of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. This is different from systemic racism. We're talking about straight up, black people are all violent killers and all Arabs are terrorists, KKK style stuff. We're also talking whites are evil devils and Jews are mud people talk. We don't get to say that a group or a person can only be racist if it has power. That's false. Because if you have the ability to get someone fired because you think they said a word you don't like 10 years ago in a tweet, well, guess what? You've got power. It's not the same as in systemic racism, but if you're a minority and you say all white people are horrible and genetically inferior, that's racist. If you're like, Deshaun Jackson or Ilhan Omar and you're quoting and sharing anti-Semitism, that's racist, period. Racism, as a definition, ironically, it doesn't care about your skin color. We need to stop excusing things like that because it permits hate speech. Because as tired as I am of white supremacists and racism deniers, I am past the point of patience with the Church of Our Lady of Perpetual Victimhood, constantly looking at history through revisionism to rewrite it so that everything white is inherently evil, and tilting at windmills to justify their own prejudices and hatred by blaming them for everything. That helps nothing. It further entrenches actual racists. It further devalues actual racism, and turns people away because it quickly becomes clear that people like that have no interest in actually making things better, but rather just want the poles flipped in revenge, and to push a fictitious historical narrative with the blessing of others, even in the white community, that stays silent out of pressure and misguided guilt, except to spontaneously virtue signal how great they are, and so against all the whites who aren't them because they're obviously always one of the good ones, amazingly, and act like desperate pets looking to get a scrap from the new radical social justice table. Who's a good ally? Yes, you are. Come on. Pushing for shows and movies to be more open to greater representation and different voices? Awesome. I agree. Great. But bullying creators and making them feel that they have to go through a TSA-type screening of arbitrary checkboxes or else risk internet hive mob cancellation? That's veering into some very dangerous waters there. These are the types of things that are exactly like what Terry Crews was warning about. Movements careening toward supremacy and vengeance, among other things. I'm not going to call some black person the N-word, and I expect whites to follow suit. Don't. White people need to stop saying, well, it should be okay because black people use it in songs and call each other that. No! That's something even people in the black community aren't fans of. And while I don't think a word of hate, which is what it is a hate word, it was created to show hate, I don't think that word should ever be used. But I'm not going to go out there and use it myself, and neither should any other white person. And really, be honest. A lot of white people only seem to be mad that black people use it because it's something that they're not allowed to. It's something that they can't have that another group can. And that's not a good feeling, is it? There's a lesson there. So if a black person wants to keep it alive and they feel it's empowering and they want to take it back, hey, that's them. I'm not going to. I expect a black person not to call a Jewish person the K word or say kill whitey. I don't think that's unreasonable. While systemic racism is a thing, it is different than individual racism. Otherwise, hate crimes would just be one-sided, and they're not. The Nation of Islam and New Black Panther Party aren't designated as hate groups by the Southern Poverty Law Center because white people don't like them. It's because of their violent, hate-filled rhetoric. Same reason the KKK are. So stop making excuses why it's different. Stop letting schools teach that only white people are capable of racism, as my daughter was told when she asked a very serious question about why they weren't discussing the role of Africans selling slaves in and out of Africa before and after colonialism. Because she and I had been recently talking about a child trafficking ring that was busted and how they took down the buyers and the sellers. She wanted to know why it wasn't the same thing. Don't think I didn't call the school and give them hell. Again, systemic and individual racism, two different things. Don't conflate or make excuses for them. At the same time, remove monuments for Confederate soldiers. I don't care how many of you Southerners cry at this. The Confederate flag is not a cultural icon to worship and revere. The Confederacy was an insurrectionist trashland that lost. Period. They're not monuments to American war heroes. They're monuments to losers and traitors to the true America. You know why the San Francisco Giants have a statue of Willie Mays in front of the stadium and not Johnny LeMaster? Because Mays was a winner and didn't suck. Remove the statues, put them in a museum so we never forget, the same way camps are still standing from the Holocaust in Europe. Don't tear down battlefields of the Civil War, but don't memorialize the enemy. Do we have plaques honoring the 100-plus Japanese killed in the Pearl Harbor attack, or Muhammad Atta's name at the World Trade Center site? No, exactly. And everyone, please stop rushing off to some cause, no matter how mostly peaceful it's supposed to be, or going post-crazy on social media until you have the facts. This is something I'm going to be addressing again in the final video with the media, but it needs to be said here. Too many times we have people going off half-cocked the second an event happens, and they just need to tell everyone about it, and or show how woke or tuned in they are, or how bad the other side is, or whatever. But you need to be careful, because as we saw in DC and Lancaster, there was no wrongful shoot. Black Lives Matter leaders weren't supporting a sex trafficker. In Chicago, a random teen wasn't gunned down. The Democrats are not using BLM as a fundraising cover. And as we saw eventually in Ferguson, that wasn't what we thought it was either. And if you do jump to conclusions and you're wrong, just own it. That goes a long way. I've said it before. Just come out and say, okay, we were wrong. We'll be better. That's a huge thing. And I'm going to speak a bit about that when I talk about athletes in a few minutes, but I remember at least 12 people on my timeline on Facebook posting seemingly every 5 minutes when the Jussie Smollett case broke. Now, I called from day one it was BS. It was too neat, too perfect, and also a little too imperfect. And my investigative senses were tingling. I was labeled a racist by several of those people, incidentally. But those 12 people, once the truth came out, no apologies. Not only was nothing said, but they went and deleted their earlier posts, trying to clean it up like they were never all in. Own it. There's nothing inherently wrong with being wrong. It's being wrong and refusing to admit it that's the problem. Not knowing where you went wrong so you don't make that mistake that's the problem. It's pretending you weren't attacking everyone for weeks over something. That's the problem. And I've said it before, I know it's hard to ask for patience and trust in a system that's been flawed. But if you're going to go all in to the point you're having fundraisers and writing Congress and attacking anyone who doesn't agree, you damn well better be sure. Because even when you delete things, the internet often remembers. It's like Baskin-Robbins. They always find out. Like when Congresswoman Slave tweeted out that a hate crime on a Jewish business in New York was a side effect of Trump's white racism. And then it turned out the shooter was a black racist. She deleted the tweet, but we got the receipt. That hurts credibility and weakens causes because trust is a hard thing to gain back, especially when it's blown so spectacularly in the day of the internet. So as the old saying goes, trust but verify. My daughter is 11. I've already told her if she wants to participate in a walkout or a march or whatever, even if I don't agree with it, unless it's some racist nonsense, in which case she's never leaving the house again. But even if I don't agree with her, I'll back her up. But first, she owes me a 5-page typed paper on the issue, showing multiple sides so that I can see that she truly understands what she's going for and what's going on besides a random thing she saw a celebrity say or a quick blurb online or because all her friends are doing it. If she can demonstrate that, she can demonstrate. And if she's arrested doing something peaceful, like lunch counter sit-ins that were popular in the 50s and 60s, fine. I'll come bail her out. We'll deal with it. But if she's like these idiots rioting and destroying things and gets arrested, well, that's where she's going to stay. They say you can't put a price on a parent's love for a child. I argue you can. And it's whatever the county sets the bail at. Sorry, play stupid games, win stupid prizes. If you're going to pick a hill to die on, make sure it's actually one you should be standing on in the first place. Now, athletes and celebrities, it's your turn. Athletes and other celebrities have a unique place in our society in which they're able to do things for a living most people think of as more simple or less important than things like teaching or whatever else. But they do have impacts and they do have platforms from which to be heard and amplify the voices of different causes, for good or ill. That right there is a form of privilege, and it's part of why it's hard to be lectured on my already self-admitted privilege and being made to feel guilty for it because I'm so infinitely blessed by someone who made over $5 million to pitch every 5 days or play in a few snaps a week and can be heard and followed and liked and retweeted when I'm an unemployed stay-at-home father trying to hold a household together during a pandemic and can't get a dozen people to share or view anything I write. The thing with celebrities is that most do mean well. Pretty much none of them ask to be put up on these pedestals. So I know they want to contribute. I get it. Even when well-intentioned, some of those contributions seem less helpful than they do empty gestures. It's a kind of delicate line that they walk because most of them, like I said, they didn't set out to be role models or have constant spotlights on them in a day of nonstop media. They just wanted to do something they love for a living. So it's understandable they want to use that privilege of such a position to speak on a matter or voice an opinion. But part of the downside is that not all of them are actually versed in topics they're opining on, and they don't have all the facts all the time, but they're still treated as gospel truth nonetheless by followers who equate celebrity status to some sort of enlightenment. They're, quote, important, that means they must be listened to. Now, that's not to say that celebrities by and large are ignorant. It's not true. But that there needs to be more care into what and how they say things, because their words do carry weight, whether they know it or not. And when you've got an athlete or celebrity tweeting out, say, an address of George Zimmerman with a veiled thread attached, yeah, that's going to get a reaction that wouldn't happen if, say, I did that. I don't have the reach or amplification. When you have celebrities saying inane things like tampons will cause infertility or that meat sits in your stomach for 40 years, people are likely to listen to it. And that's insane, but that's just the way it is. But it's definitely not an enviable position all the time. And it's also why they need to be especially careful about things like burn it all down or passing off false information or half-truths as facts. In the wake of the anti-Semitic comments I've talked about, a Jewish group found that some of these celebrities tweeting and retweeting these statements had a combined number of internet followers greater than the entire population of Jews on the planet, so they were understandably nervous when a single person can spread anti-Semitic messages and reach more people than almost all the Jews in the world could as individuals. One of the more notable protests we've seen from celebrities has been in the world of professional sports, particularly an act popularized by former 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick, that of taking a knee during the national anthem before a game. Sports protests are not new, but they've been raised to a different level in this age. This move incensed a lot of people, particularly on the right end of the political spectrum, as they felt it was disrespectful to the nation and to the flag and to those who served in the military. For the ones who chose to kneel, they were doing it to express their unhappiness with and raise awareness for injustice in the legal system. Now me, I am personally not offended one bit at kneeling during the anthem. I'm not. I don't find it unpatriotic, not even a little bit. In fact, it's your right as an American to peacefully protest, and we've seen that already. I used to be asked about that all the time at the White House when someone would have a picture of President Bush, as a turbaned terrorist. Hey, how can you allow that, man? And I'd answer because they've got freedom of speech and the right to do it. So long as it's not hate speech and they're not hurting anybody, oh well. Paraphrasing Voltaire, it's not whether I agree or not with a statement or a lawful protest message, it's about my willingness to defend their rights to say it. The NFL management is okay with it. They're not hurting anybody. Let them kneel. You can kneel and not hate your country. The two things aren't linked. But you can also stand and still support Black Lives Mattering. And that's the other end of the curve, where athletes are being pressured and bullied into kneeling or else they're slammed on social media or by other players. You don't have to kneel to show solidarity. This goes back to the guys trying to force that woman to raise her fist. Just as your kneeling doesn't mean you don't support America, someone's decision not to kneel doesn't mean they don't support Black Lives Mattering. A U.S. women's soccer team, one of the players, she came under fire recently for not kneeling because she chooses to stand out of respect to her family that serves in the military. But she stood with her hand on the shoulder of her black teammate to whom she spoke to about it, and they both understand one another's actions and supported them. Recently, it's become more charged through sports as face masks that are needed, they're utilized because of the COVID-19 crisis. They have social justice slogans and more athletes are kneeling. Now, the NBA does this, but they were also rightly criticized for evading answers on whether it would allow statements on Hong Kong, in addition to BLM, given its association with and lack of calling out China, a nation in which ESPN reported had virtual slave labor and inhumane conditions in their NBA-linked basketball camps, and whose government has brutally suppressed democracy movements. So to be fair, it's kind of hard to see Nike, who's been in repeated trouble for its sweatshops in foreign countries, sponsoring these garments in a lot of places and the movements and players wearing the products that they're speaking out against, while speaking out against social injustices. It's like, dude, fix your own shop, But in the NFL, teams have been wearing the names of Black Americans that have been or are believed to have been killed wrongly by police. Others are just wearing slogans, but on the Pittsburgh Steelers, it's recently become a bit of a hot button topic because Al Villanueva crossed the name of Antoine Rose. He crossed it out. It was a black teen who was killed by the hands of cops in the cities, whose name had adorned most of the helmets of the rest of the team. He replaced it with a black veteran killed in combat. Now, Villanueva is a veteran himself and was already the only player to not kneel. And both actions upset a great many people, but made him a hero to others. And in fairness, a lot in those latter group, still feel no matter what, that kneeling of any kind and all of this stuff is unpatriotic and the NFL is nothing but anti-American and all these players are anti-American. That's patently absurd. But it didn't end there, as the team captain, Marquise Pouncey, who is black, opted to put the name of a black police officer killed in the line of duty in Pittsburgh, citing that he has close working relationships with the police in trying to help them better serve the community, and that he didn't have all the facts on the Antoine Rose case before he agreed to go along with it. Now, that case involved the drive-by shooting, which Rose participated in as an accessory, and after a stop by the cops, he was shot running away with another passenger. Gunshot residue on his hands and his DNA on a gun at the scene were key. That was key evidence that led to the officer being cleared. Now, to some people, it seemed he was innocent because the video did show he was indeed present, but didn't fire shots in that specific drive-by in that specific footage. And it was actually a third man identified in the car that was ultimately charged. But the victim claimed it was definitely him at the time and identified him by name. He said it was coming from some sort of ongoing mutual feud between the two of them. So that's why for others, they felt it was a justified situation because here's the victim saying it was him. And here's Mr. Rose himself running from a car with weapons and bullet holes in it from retaliatory fire to the drive-by. Regardless, it wasn't an open and shut case, but it's been viewed by some as a miscarriage of justice in the intervening years. So Pouncey feels there's not enough evidence where he's entirely convinced, and so he couldn't in good faith wear the name, and that's his prerogative, whether he's right or wrong. He's choosing to honor another fallen black American. That hasn't protected him from outrage from those mad he's not towing the line, but again, he has just as much freedom, and if the NFL is going to open this box to wear slogans and names on helmets and things like that, this is something they need to stand by, and to their credit, they are. But while I fully support doing the things with the names and the kneeling, there are some questions that should be asked. For one, some have Jacob Blake's name on the helmet. Now, we've already discussed that case, and it's under review still. But even if he was wrongly shot, putting the name of a guy who still has an active warrant out on him for a violent rape isn't sending the right message either. And saying, well, he hasn't been convicted of it contradicts not only the #BelieveAllWomen movement, but the fact that neither has the police officer involved been convicted of anything. When you have other names of people that happen to be black and killed but weren't innocent and were involved in what are legally termed good shoots, that dilutes some of the impact, as the spots, to me, should be reserved not for opinions of that nature, but for legitimate victims, like, say, Walter Scott, who was murdered by a cop blatantly in South Carolina several years back, or even Trayvon Martin, who wasn't shot by a cop but was wrongfully killed nonetheless. Because, see, here's the thing. Taking a knee is all well and good and a peaceful symbolic gesture. But if it's coupled with nothing else, what is it really accomplishing? Awareness? People are aware. Now, some people are opposed to it because they don't understand or misconstrue it, but there are those people who question it not because they feel it's, bad or, unpatriotic, but they wonder, is it really accomplishing anything tangible? During World War II, more than 500 Major League Baseball players served to fight global injustices by the Nazis, whether they were drafted or they voluntarily enlisted. They risked their lives, lucrative careers, and potential enshrinements in the Hall of Fame to do what they felt was right. And we're not just talking about scrub players riding the bench. There were guys like Ted Williams and Joe DiMaggio in there. DiMaggio played only 7 seasons before serving for 3 years, then came back for 6 more. Williams only played 4 of his 19 seasons pre-war. Now, granted, they had relatively cushy deployments, but they were only 2 of over 500. There were also a couple of players who gave their lives. Many received medals and commendations. Players like Warren Spahn fought in the Battle of the Bulge, and Bob Feller spurned a $100,000 contract, which is about $1.7 million today, to enlist after the attack on Pearl Harbor and saw combat in the Pacific Theater before returning to be a Hall of Fame pitcher and World Series champion in Cleveland. Today's athletes, they're taking a night off or kneeling for 2 minutes, and for most of them, that's it. When you do something for someone, and they thank you, and you respond, don't mention it. It's the least I could do for you. That's this. This is the least that they can do. They're not Rosa Parks, refusing to give up her seat on the bus. They're not John Lewis, refusing to leave the lunch counter. They're collecting millions to stay at home and tweet, or kneel for 120 seconds. And they're typically not even there at the protests like some other celebrities to their credit have been. For the most part, they're risking virtually nothing. The league minimum in the NFL, at least as of last season, was just over $500,000. Just like that for entry level. I'd love that. That'd be awesome. But I know the players play more than just the 16 games on their schedule, not counting playoffs if eligible. And they have practice and meetings and stuff like that, training camps. But we often hear salaries broken down in terms of they make X amount per game. So let's use that, all right? So a rookie's pulling in $510,000 at the minimum. So that's just shy of $32,000 a game. The average length of an NFL game is just over 3 hours, but let's say 4 because they arrive early for warm-ups and stuff like that. It's an easier number to work with. Because remember, these are just illustrative numbers here, all right? So that means they're making nearly $8,000 an hour if we go by the X per games figure. That's the minimum, assuming 16 4-hour games. Now let's drill down further. It means they're making $132 and change per minute. So just over $265 if the anthem is a full 2 minutes. It can range anywhere from 90 seconds upward, depends on who's singing it, all right? There are about 53 players on the average roster. So that means one team with these numbers is earning over $14,000 just during a 2-minute performance of the national anthem, not counting coaching personnel and staff. 16 times a year, at least. And that's assuming they're all at league minimum, which we know isn't the case because there are people making millions per year. The poverty line threshold for a family of 4 in America is at around $26,000 annually. That means in one game, during 2 minutes, an NFL roster is making more than half of what a family of 4 on the poverty line is making during an entire year. And they're doing that 16 times a year, at least. And again, that's just using the league minimum. And there are 32 teams. And they're being hailed as heroes for kneeling. They're raising awareness. But how many are actually doing something else and putting their money towards causes that would actually help prevent crime? For all my issues with Kaepernick, who I find a lot of phoniness in, and his wearing cops as pig socks and calling for the abolishment of police undercuts his claim of being not an anti-cop, and his past fines, for uttering a racial slur at a player and once saying and then retracting that he'd been treated by black teammates in a racist manner because he wasn't black enough, it rubbed me the wrong way. But I have to respect that man has put his money where his mouth is more than a few times and has given generously to his community. I mean, he's out there on holidays, delivering meals to the needy, things like that, dedicating time and money. That has got to get props and respect. It does. The same in the NBA with LeBron James. He's done a lot. Credit where it's due. And they're not the only guys, right? There are many athletes that are doing much more than just kneeling. And we don't hear about it, but they are. Whether it's donating money or their time for various causes, not just social justice ones, and I have the utmost respect for that. But the point I'm making is that a lot of these players aren't doing that. They're taking off for a night or kneeling for a few minutes and then calling it a day. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. This isn't to shame them. But just imagine for a second if all the players kneeling, just in the NFL, donated just the money they're earning during those 2 minutes to put towards programs, things like community outreach in schools and things for the youth and so on, how much more of a difference that could make, especially since they're loudly demanding change, and this is some change that they actually have some power to effectuate beyond kneeling. Because writing a name on a helmet, it's not doing a goddamn thing. Using the numbers above, we're in a team of 53, all making the league minimum and assuming a 4-hour game and making about $14,000 a game during the anthem, then multiplying that by 16 teams, then multiplying that by 32 teams, by 16 games rather, then multiplying that by 32 teams. That's a minimum of $7.1 million a year that can help fund these programs. A lot of celebrities run their mouths about how evil capitalism is as they haggle over millions per episode or concert or game. Instead of pumping millions towards a presidential candidate that might or might not win, just in the hopes that he or she might be able to fix things, but not being responsible for giving those donations back should they fail, maybe this is a better solution towards making some things right. Because I'll tell you what, doing what I just said would make a hell of a lot more impact than a mask with a logo or a helmet with a name written on it. Now look, I know the numbers above, they're not perfect. They rely on specific values for X's and Y's, but again, it was to illustrate that it can be seen and in reality be more than an empty peer pressure virtue signal where people who don't want to kneel are automatically burned at the virtual stake. There are definitely players doing things like this, or even other things for their communities and other worthy causes, and I definitely do commend them. I'm not mentioning those other causes because, you know what, neither is the NFL most of the time. And the NFL, I'm a little I have a little bit of skepticism because this is an organization that's played kid gloves with rapists, accessories to murder, drug abusers, and perpetrators of domestic violence for years. And now suddenly they grew a conscience when its bottom dollar might have been taken a hit, and they didn't have to risk further drops in attendance as a potential consequence because the stands were pretty much empty already because of COVID-19. So yeah, I do kind of question how much of this is altruism, but that's neither here nor there. Now, the entertainment industry is also rife with celebrities who love to talk, and tweet, whether it's James Woods, whose conservative commentary is often not half as intelligent or witty as his fan base or he seems to think, or Alyssa Milano on the other side, who we've already discussed. They share these same responsibilities, and we've seen careers elevated and deep-sixed alike because of tweets and posts as fans become rabid and almost cult-like in their adherence. I'm tired of seeing a celebrity post shared with a comment that simply says, "this," with an arrow pointing to it, especially if the post is wrong. One, if all you can say about an issue you allege to be passionate about is what someone else did, well, you're really not as much of an activist you're trying to pass yourself off as. You're a parrot. Two, if you haven't fact-checked, stop treating it as this, because misinformation we've already seen and will more in the next video, it can be tremendously dangerous and even potentially deadly at times. Calling for a defunding or complete disbanding of police is a dangerous statement that a lot of these celebrities don't fully understand the ramifications of, because they're not by and large living in this immediate danger people in some cities are, not from cops, but from other citizens. Of course, someone who lives in a gated community with armed guards doesn't see why people want security or the right to bear arms because they don't have those concerns. And we're going to come back to the idea of defunding in the next video and ways we can still reallocate funds without hamstringing the security of a city. But it's the same with these celebrities and people who want to abolish ICE because they disagree with federal immigration laws. I'm certain that the literal thousands of women and children who ICE has helped rescue from sex trafficking over the years don't want them totally gone. Maybe remember those unintended victims, of your self-righteous and short-sighted slogans. Screaming "burn it all down" to millions of followers could not be seen as anything other than inciting violence, no matter how much you try to backpedal or say you meant it metaphorically. No, you didn't. Threatening to dox cops? No defense. All right? Tweeting videos that were edited or information not fact-checked, that's not helping at all, especially since when you post them, your reach enables them to be shared so much that all the subsequent facts to the contrary wind up buried and unheard. So when someone like Candace Owens shares a video of an alleged violent event at a protest, and it's from an event that's unrelated, and then the President of the United States picks it up and runs with it, look at how that hurts things. When a celebrity is crying about the 1% running everything and saying they support Marxist and socialist type systems, why are most of them never the ones giving up their stuff? I don't care what your background is. You don't get to lecture an unemployed stay-at-home father who risked his life for his country and works his butt off his entire life on privilege when you're getting paid millions to play a child's game or read a script. You're complaining about the 1%. Sweetheart, you are the 1%. All right? When celebrities post false statistics to show that violence by police against minorities isn't real, as I've seen some conservative celebrities do, and all it takes is a simple fact check to show them how the numbers are wrong, and people don't do that, that's a problem that perpetuates racism, especially if they do acknowledge the fact check, but then only say it's, they only acknowledge it just to say it's a lie to cover for some insidious terrorist agenda of the left. And they call for people to get ready for a fight in a way that's just as incendiary as those calls to burn things down. Look, there are so many celebrities who do great things, even those I've mentioned that have done some not great things. So I don't want to make it all out that celebrities are bad and useless, and I don't expect them to dump all their money at the drop of a hat. But I do call on them to be more responsible in their actions and their words. I do call on them to be consistent and not say they respect all women, and then call the First Lady a feckless cunt, or say racist things about First Lady Obama. And I do call on them to act the way they extol others to and be willing to make the same sacrifices they're demanding of others. Putting together funds for people arrested at protests, even if they weren't just passive resistors but violent criminals intent on harming and causing destruction. You know what? Think about that. Especially if you're not just as vociferously asking for funds to help these businesses of innocent black owners destroyed by this enabling attitude, and when you're denying that you had any role in the instigation. Do their black lives and livelihoods all not matter? Are we going to create two different sets of rules for whose lives matters or not, whilst protesting against exactly that? Because no matter how you cut it, if you say burn all their shit down with pictures of buildings on fire, there's really no room for interpretation for you to weasel out of. And if they're wrong, hey, tweet those apologies out just the same so that your followers know. Because again, that's a key part in quashing false stories. We're going to hit on this some more in the final video with, the quote fake news and the like, but for now it suffices to say that when you're in these powerful positions to be heard, it's Spider-Man's, great power, great responsibility shtick. You have to be aware of the impact your actions and words have, even if you may not intend them to be. And when you're part of a Hollywood industry constantly under fire for its lack of diverse casting and whitewashing of minority roles and treatment of minority actors and actresses, maybe put down that rock in your multi-million-dollar glass house before you toss it, and start pushing your own industry more to practice what you're preaching to everyone else. Just a thought. Now, so far we've covered a lot. In this video, we talked about ways that ordinary people and celebrities can do things to more effectively change things for the better, and how gestures are nice, but it takes more than just those. It takes real action and viable solutions, not just slogans, and it takes open and honest communication and self-reflection. Calling to disband the police or slash all the funding is a provably false, bad idea. And we're going to see that, and we've already seen that in some areas. But it doesn't mean we can't work with that as a loose framework to find some sort of compromise position. And in the next video, we're going to look at what politicians, the media, and especially, most importantly, obviously, law enforcement should and really must do to fix a broken system so that racial equality can be an actual reality that it hasn't been for minorities in America for far too long. So I thank you as always for sticking around. I hope you join me as the season premiere miniseries event on #TheThing draws to a close tomorrow afternoon in the next entry, #TheThing episode 1.5, Racism in America, Media, Politics, and Police for a More Equitable Nation. So please click that subscribe button and join in the movement. I hope to see you there tomorrow.